The handcuffs clicked with a hollow metallic snap that echoed over the hum of the gas station canopy. Toby thought he was doing his job. He didn't know the man he'd just shoved against the cruiser outranked him, outclassed him, and was about to end his career with a single, tired sigh. The July heat didn't break when the sun went down. It just hung there, thick and wet, smelling of hot asphalt, and the faint, sweet stench of rotting garbage from the alleyways. Officer Toby Miller sat in his cruiser, the air conditioning blasting a stream of recycled dusty air directly into his face. It did nothing to cool the sweat pooling beneath his Kevlar vest. The heavy armor felt like a straitjacket. He adjusted his duty belt, the stiff leather digging into his hip bone, a constant dull ache that reminded him he was 6 months out of the academy and still hadn't figured out how to wear the gear without it leaving bruises. He was parked across the street from a generic 24-hour convenience store. The neon open sign had a dead P buzzing with a high-pitched electrical whine that set Toby's teeth on edge. The radio was mostly quiet, just intermittent bursts of static and dispatch codes that didn't concern his sector. Then a charcoal grey sedan pulled up to pump number 4. Toby sat up straighter, the vinyl seat squeaking beneath him. The car was dusty, unremarkable. The driver stepped out. He was a black man, maybe late 40s, heavy-set, but solid, wearing faded denim jeans and an untucked grey Henley shirt. He moved with a slow, deliberate kind of exhaustion. He swiped a credit card, grabbed the pump nozzle, and leaned against the rear quarter panel of the sedan. Toby's eyes flicked to the man's waistline. When the man reached up to stretch his back, the fabric of the Henley pulled tight. There, resting on his right hip, was a sharp, unmistakable geometric bulge. It wasn't a cell phone. The hard angle of the grip printed clearly against the thin cotton. Toby's heart kicked against his ribs. A hard, erratic thump. Concealed weapon. In his head, the academy instructors were shouting, "Complacency kills. Watch the hands. Control the environment." But underneath those drilled commands was a deeper, uglier static. A nervous hum of raw anxiety. Toby was 23. He had drawn his sidearm exactly once outside the firing range, and his hands had shaken for an hour afterward. He wanted to be a good cop. He wanted to be the sharp-eyed rookie who pulled illegal guns off the street. He shifted the cruiser into drive, pulling out from the shadows and rolling across the street. The heavy tires crunched over the shattered glass, and discarded lottery tickets littering the station's concrete apron. He hit the lights, just the flashing reds and blues washing the dusty sedan and the man in harsh, strobing colors. The man didn't flinch. He didn't run. He just turned his head, slowly looking at the cruiser with eyes that seemed more annoyed than afraid. He had a salt and pepper beard, neatly trimmed, and a face lined with deep grooves. Toby killed the engine, unclipped his radio mic, and called in his location. His voice cracked slightly on the street name. He cleared his throat, disgusted with himself, and pushed the door open. The humidity hit him like a wet towel. "Evening, sir," Toby said. He kept his right hand resting on the butt of his Glock. The textured grip felt rough and familiar against his sweaty palm. "Need you to step away from the vehicle." The man looked at Toby, then down at the gas nozzle still pumping into his car. "It's pumping, officer. I'll be done in a second." His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, completely devoid of panic. "I said step away from the vehicle, sir. Now." Toby's volume went up, compensating for the tremor in his legs. The man sighed. It was a long, heavy sound. He reached over, clicked the pump off, and took a half step back, leaving his hands resting casually on his hips. The movement exposed the bulge under his shirt again. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Toby barked, drawing his weapon in a fluid, panic-fueled motion. He leveled the barrel at the man's chest. The black front sight wavered slightly. The man's eyes locked onto the muzzle of the gun, then shifted to Toby's face. The annoyance evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp stillness. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands to shoulder-height, palms open. "Son," the man said, his voice dropping an octave, slow and steady. "You need to take a breath. Lower the weapon. I have identification in my left breast pocket." "Don't call me son. Turn around, face the car," Toby yelled. The adrenaline was a roar in his ears, now drowning out everything else. The buzzing neon sign, the distant highway traffic, it all vanished. There was only the gun, the man, and the frantic need to establish control. He was terrified, and that terror disguised itself as aggression. "I am turning around," the man said softly. He rotated on his heels, placing his hands on the dusty roof of the sedan. "Officer, my name is David Ross. If you look in my—" "Spread your legs. Do it." Toby closed the distance, keeping his gun raised, while he reached for his cuffs with his left hand. He grabbed the man's left wrist, yanking it back. The wrist was thick, the skin dry and warm. Toby shoved the man's torso hard against the roof of the car. Ross grunted as the metal bowed slightly under his weight, but he didn't fight back. "You're making a mistake, officer," Ross said to the painted metal of his car. His breath fogged against the dusty window. "Shut up." Toby holstered his weapon, his hands shaking so badly he fumbled the snaps on his cuff pouch. He yanked Ross's right arm behind his back, forcing the wrists together. The handcuffs clicked, ratcheting tight. He squeezed them an extra click, digging the metal into the skin, checking the double locks with clumsy, trembling fingers. Toby patted down the man's right hip, pulling up the Henley to reveal a matte black Sig Sauer, resting in a worn leather inside the waistband holster, carrying a concealed firearm. Toby panted, his chest heaving. "You're under arrest." "It's a duty weapon," Ross said, his voice muffled by the angle of his head. "Left, breast, pocket." Toby ignored him. He was riding the high of the takedown now. He had neutralized a threat. He had done it by the book, or at least his panicked tunnel vision version of the book. He grabbed Ross by the bicep, hauling him upright. The man towered over Toby by a good 3 inches, but his posture was defeated, slumped in a way that made him look suddenly very old. Toby walked him to the back of the cruiser, pushing his head down to clear the doorframe, and shoved him into the hard plastic shell of the back seat. The door slammed shut, heavy and final. Toby stood in the parking lot alone for a second. The humid air suddenly smelled distinctly of spilled gasoline and his own sour sweat. He looked at the gun he'd pulled from the man's waistband. It wasn't a cheap street piece. It was clean, well-oiled, the grip worn smooth from years of use. He shoved it into an evidence bag, threw it in the passenger seat, and got behind the wheel. The ride to the station took 12 minutes. It was the longest 12 minutes of Toby's life. He expected the guy in the back to rage, to yell about his rights, to spit at the plexiglass partition, to kick the doors. That's what they usually did. But David Ross did nothing. Toby kept checking the rearview mirror. The streetlights flashed through the back window, illuminating Ross's face in rhythmic yellow intervals. The man just sat there, staring straight ahead at the metal grating. He wasn't panting. He wasn't shaking. He looked entirely bored, which somehow made Toby's stomach churn. The silence was suffocating. The only sounds were the hum of the cruiser's tires on the pavement and the rhythmic hollow rattling of the plastic divider. Toby turned the radio up slightly to drown it out, but the crackling dispatch voices offered no comfort. "Dispatch Unit 4. Toby keyed the mic. "Transporting 1 male heading to Central." "Copy 4. Toby pulled into the precinct's underground garage. The concrete walls were stained with exhaust fumes and leaked oil. He parked in the intake bay, cut the engine, and took a deep breath, trying to slow his racing heart. "You did good," he told himself. "Gun off the street." The internal pep talk felt flimsy, like wet cardboard. He opened the back door and hauled Ross out. The man's knees popped as he stood up, his face tightening slightly in pain as the handcuffs pulled his shoulders back awkwardly. Toby gripped him by the elbow, marching him toward the heavy steel doors of the intake area. The precinct was a sensory assault. The harsh blue-white fluorescent tubes hanging from the ceiling buzzed like angry hornets, casting a sickly pallor over everything. The air conditioning was cranked to a frigid temperature, smelling sharply of industrial lemon floor cleaner and stale burnt coffee. Telephones rang in a chaotic overlapping chorus. Toby walked Ross up to the booking desk. Desk Sergeant Gregson was on duty. Gregson was a 30-year veteran with a stomach that strained the buttons of his uniform shirt and a face that looked like a crumpled paper bag. He was typing methodically with 2 fingers on a sticky keyboard, a half-eaten powdered donut resting on a napkin beside his mouse. "Got a walk-in, Toby?" Gregson asked, without looking up, his voice a thick, phlegmy rumble. "Yeah, Sarge," Toby said, trying to sound authoritative. He nudged Ross forward. "Carrying concealed without a permit, refused commands, combative." "Combative," Ross murmured softly, his tone dry. "That's a creative interpretation." "Quiet," Toby snapped. Gregson hit the enter key, sighed, and finally looked up. His eyes dragged over Toby, then shifted to the man in handcuffs. The color drained from Gregson's face so fast it looked like a magic trick. The bored, tired expression vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid shock. His jaw actually went slack, revealing a piece of chewed donut resting on his tongue. He swallowed hard. "Toby," Gregson whispered. The ambient noise of the precinct seemed to drop a few decibels. "What the hell did you do?" Toby frowned, his chest puffing out slightly defensive. "I told you, Sarge. Caught him pumping gas, saw the piece on his hip. He didn't want to play ball." Gregson stood up. His chair shrieked against the linoleum floor. He didn't look at Toby. He looked straight at Ross. "David," Gregson said, his voice cracking. "Jesus Christ, David." Ross didn't smile. He just nodded slowly, his broad shoulders shifting against the strain of the cuffs. "Hello, Mike. It's been a while. Wish the circumstances were better." Toby felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his spine. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. "Sarge, you know this guy?" Gregson ignored the rookie completely. He hurried out from behind the raised booking desk, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. He stopped in front of Ross, his hands hovering nervously in the air, as if he wanted to take the cuffs off by sheer willpower, but didn't have the key. "Officer Miller." Ross said, his voice projecting clearly into the suddenly quiet booking area. He turned his head just enough to look Toby in the eye. "My wallet is in my left breast pocket. I told you that in the parking lot. I am telling you again now. Please take it out." Toby froze. His mouth went dry, tasting faintly of brass. He looked at Gregson, who was glaring at him with a mixture of pity and sheer, unrestrained fury. "Do it, Miller," Gregson hissed. "Now." Toby's hands were shaking again, but for an entirely different reason. He reached out his fingers, brushing against the worn cotton of Ross's Henley. He felt the thick square of a leather wallet in the pocket. He pulled it out. It was heavy. "Flip it open," Ross instructed calmly. Toby flipped the leather open. The harsh fluorescent lights caught the polished silver of a heavy star-shaped badge recessed into the leather. Above it, an identification card bearing David Ross's face. The text was stark and undeniable. United States Marshal, Department of Justice. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Toby's feet. A wave of nausea hit him so hard he had to lock his knees to keep from swaying. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, the silver star glaring back at him like an accusing eye. Marshal, not a gangbanger, not a drifter, a federal agent. The justifications that had been propping him up for the last 20 minutes, he fit a profile, he was slow to comply, he had a gun, collapsed into dust. The reality of what he had done slammed into him. He had drawn his weapon on a federal agent. He had shoved him against a car. He had cuffed him, ignored him, and dragged him in like a common criminal. "Keys now," Gregson demanded, holding his hand out. Toby couldn't speak. His throat was clamped shut. He fumbled blindly at his belt, unclipping the small black key, and dropped it into Gregson's palm. Gregson stepped behind Ross, his hands moving quickly. The ratchets clicked in reverse. The heavy metal cuffs fell away, dangling from Gregson's fingers. Ross brought his arms forward. He didn't rub his wrists dramatically. He just rotated his shoulders, stretching the stiff muscles, his face an impenetrable mask. He reached out and plucked his wallet from Toby's limp hand, sliding it smoothly back into his shirt pocket. "David, I am so sorry," Gregson said, his voice trembling slightly. "This kid, he's fresh. He's an idiot. I'll get Captain Davis down here right now. Don't wake Davis up for this." "Mike," Ross said, finally turning his full attention to Toby. Toby couldn't meet his gaze. He looked at the floor, at the scuff marks on the linoleum, at the tips of his own polished boots. He felt entirely naked, stripped of the authority the uniform was supposed to grant him. "Officer Miller," Ross said. The lack of anger in his voice was terrifying. It was the clinical, detached tone of a doctor diagnosing a terminal illness. Toby forced his head up. "Sir, I didn't know. You didn't announce—" "Stop!" Ross held up a single finger. "Do not do that. Do not try to reverse engineer an excuse to cover your panic." Toby snapped his mouth shut. The silence in the booking area was absolute. 4 other officers had stopped what they were doing and were staring. "You saw a black man in a rough part of town with a gun." Ross said, his voice low enough that Toby had to strain to hear it, making the words feel intimately destructive. "You didn't see a threat. You saw a stereotype. You let your fear drive the car, and your fear made you deaf. You didn't listen when I tried to de-escalate. You escalated." Ross stepped closer. He smelled of spearmint gum and old leather, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic smell of the precinct. "You think the badge makes you brave, son," Ross said quietly. "It doesn't. It just gives your cowardice a lethal consequence." Toby's breath hitched. Tears pricked the corners of his eyes. Tears of humiliation, of shame, of profound, sickening regret. He wanted to scream, to apologize, to rewind the clock an hour and just keep driving past that gas station. "Sarge," Ross called out without looking away from Toby's pale, sweating face. "Yeah, Dave," Gregson replied immediately. "I'm not pressing charges for the assault. I don't have the time or the patience for the paperwork," Ross said smoothly. "But I want his supervisor down here. And I want the body cam footage from his cruiser downloaded and queued up in an interview room. Right now." Ross finally stepped back, adjusting his shirt collar. "Don't apologize to me, Officer Miller," Ross said, turning toward the hallway that led to the supervisor's offices. "Save it for the camera. We're going to watch what you did, and you're going to tell me exactly when you stopped being a cop and started being a liability." Interview room 4 smelled like old sweat floor wax and the distinct metallic ozone tang of overheated electronics. The walls were painted a pale, institutional seafoam green that seemed designed to drain the color from the face of anyone sitting inside it. Toby sat in a rigid plastic chair. His knees were pressed tight together to keep them from shaking. Across the scratched aluminum table sat David Ross. To Toby's left stood Lieutenant Hayes, the shift commander. Hayes was a tall, gaunt man who smelled permanently of nicotine gum and stale peppermint. He had a face like a hatchet, sharp and unforgiving, and he hadn't spoken a word since he walked in and plugged the flash drive into the room's computer terminal. Hayes clicked the mouse. The monitor flickered and the body cam footage filled the screen. Toby braced himself. He remembered the parking lot as a high-threat environment, a ticking bomb. He remembered moving with tactical precision, neutralizing a danger before it could escalate. That was not what the camera saw. The audio kicked in first. A ragged wet sound filled the small room. It took Toby a second to realize it was his own breathing. He sounded like a panicked animal inhaling in sharp, shallow gasps. On the screen, the cruiser door swung open. The camera jolted wildly, the lens capturing a dizzying blur of the gas station canopy, the asphalt, and finally, Ross. Ross was just standing there. The crickets were chirping loudly in the background, a peaceful, rhythmic sound that Toby had been completely deaf to in the moment. Ross wasn't glaring. He wasn't posturing. He looked tired. "Evening, sir. Need you to step away from the vehicle." Toby's recorded voice was entirely stripped of the deep authoritative bass he had tried to project. It sounded thin, reedy, the voice of a boy playing dress-up. On the screen, Ross calmly explained that the pump was still running. "I said step away from the vehicle, sir, now." Then the gun came out. The body cam was mounted on Toby's chest, so the black slide of the Glock suddenly dominated the bottom third of the frame. Hayes reached forward and tapped the spacebar, pausing the video. He leaned in, pointing a long, bony finger at the monitor. "Look at your hands, Miller," Hayes rasped. Toby looked. The front sight of the pistol was vibrating. Not a slow drift, but a violent, frantic tremor. Toby's thumb was resting dangerously high on the frame, his trigger finger hovering a fraction of an inch from the guard. He was one loud noise, one backfiring car engine away from clenching his fist. 3.5 pounds of pressure, Ross said. His voice in the cramped room was just as calm as it was on the tape, which somehow made it worse. "That's what the factory trigger pull is on a Glock 19. 3.5 pounds of pressure between my life and your mistake." Hayes hit the spacebar again. The video played out. It showed Ross slowly raising his hands. It captured Ross's clear, deliberate instruction about the ID in his left breast pocket. "Don't call me son. Turn around, face the car." Toby closed his eyes. The heat in his face was unbearable. Listening to his own panicked screaming, watching himself physically manhandle a compliant stationary man who was actively trying to hand him a federal badge, it was physically nauseating. His stomach churned, a sour, acidic bubble rising in the back of his throat. He swallowed hard-tasting bile. He had wanted to be the wolf protecting the sheep. The tape showed a frightened, reactive kid holding a loaded cannon. The video ended with the heavy slam of the cruiser's back door, followed by a long, static shot of the empty parking lot, accompanied only by Toby's frantic, hyperventilating breath. Hayes clicked the monitor off. The black screen reflected Toby's pale, sweat-sheened face, silence stretched out thick and suffocating. The air conditioning unit in the ceiling rattled, struggling to push cold air through dusty vents. 6 months, Hayes finally said. He didn't yell. The disappointment in his voice was far heavier than anger. "You're off probation, Miller. You ride solo for 2 weeks, and you pull a gun on a U.S. Marshal pumping premium unleaded." "I saw the print on his hip," Toby whispered. It was a pathetic defense, and he knew it the second the words left his dry lips. He matched the description of the armed robberies down on 4th. "I was wearing a Henley and Jeans officer," Ross interrupted softly. "The robbery suspect you're talking about was described as a male in his 20s, wearing a red hoodie. I am 48 years old. I was driving a sedan registered to the federal government." Toby stared down at the aluminum table. He traced a deep scratch in the metal with his thumbnail, focusing on the texture to keep from completely falling apart. "I panicked." The admission tasted like ash. "Yes, you did." Ross agreed. He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the table. Panic is human, but when you put that belt on, your panic becomes public property. It becomes a weapon. If I had flinched, if I had tripped, if I had reached for that badge a second too fast, you would have shot me. Toby's jaw locked. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. It was true. He knew it was true. "I'll have my badge on your desk in 5 minutes, Lieutenant," Toby said. His voice was hollow. It was the easiest way out. Resign, run away, hide from the humiliation. "No, you won't," Ross said. Toby blinked, looking up in confusion. Ross held his gaze, his dark eyes unblinking. "If you quit, you go work private security, or you move 2 counties over and get hired by a sheriff's department desperate for bodies. You take this same fear, this same lack of control, and you unleash it on someone else, someone who doesn't know how to stand perfectly still." Ross turned to Hayes. "He doesn't get fired, Jim. He gets broken down." Hayes crossed his arms, his face tightening. "I can't put him back in a car, David, not after this. Then you put him at the intake desk for 6 months. Let him process every drunk, every addict, every scared teenager that comes through those doors. Let him learn how to talk to people without his hand on his holster." Ross stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the linoleum. "And when he gets back in a car, he rides with a veteran, not to learn how to shoot, to learn how to breathe." Ross didn't wait for Hayes to agree. He simply turned and walked toward the door. As his hand hit the doorknob, he paused and looked back over his shoulder at Toby. "You're lucky today, Miller," Ross said, his tone devoid of any warmth. "Not because I didn't fire you, but because you don't have to go home and wash my blood out of your uniform. Think about that every time you touch your gun." The door clicked shut behind him. Hayes stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door before turning his gaze back to Toby. "Strip the belt, Miller. Go put it in your locker. You're on desk duty until I figure out what to do with you." Toby didn't argue. He couldn't. He stood up his legs, feeling like they were made of lead. He walked out of the interview room, ignoring the sideways glances from the other officers in the bullpen. He kept his eyes on the scuffed floor tiles, navigating by memory toward the locker room. The locker room was empty. It smelled of damp towels, cheap deodorant, and leather polish. Toby walked to locker 42. He didn't open it immediately. He reached down to his duty belt. His fingers found the heavy plastic buckle. He squeezed the release tabs. The belt dropped slightly, the sudden loss of tension, a stark physical relief around his waist. He pulled the belt off and set it carefully on the wooden bench. It hit the wood with a heavy clattering thud. The handcuffs, the spare magazines, the radio, the flashlight, and the dark, blocky shape of the Glock 19. Toby sat down on the bench next to the gear. The adrenaline had completely burned out of his system, leaving behind a cold, shivering exhaustion. He stared at the gun. He thought about the smooth, worn handle of Ross's Sig Sauer. He thought about the 3.5 pounds of pressure. He thought about the crickets chirping on the video. He leaned his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his hands. The rough fabric of his uniform sleeves scratched against his cheeks. He took a breath, trying to draw the air deep into his lungs, but his chest felt impossibly tight. He was a cop. He had the badge. He had the gun. But as he sat alone in the quiet locker room, listening to the distant, chaotic hum of the